Hello and welcome to the version 6.11 release notes review. So a few interesting releases in this one, perhaps a little more technical and data based. So the first one here is just an extra trigger added to the Zapier integration. So of course you need the Zapier integration enabled for your site, and then we have in Zapier a new trigger event, which is this one here called update recurring subscription. So basically this triggers whenever a recurring event is created, changed or renewed. So basically there's three main types of recurring objects. So we have a form, so just if you have a general recurring payment for all forms, just an arbitrary payment, that order can recur. Module items, so that covers products and events, so if they're recurring, and secure zone subscriptions, so obviously they can be recurring as well. So once that change is triggered, that can go through Zapier and you can do whatever you need to do with it, and this is the data that is pushed through that you can work with. So basically it tells you the code, which is kind of like the order code that gets assigned to that, and the status, so what actually is changed about the subscription. So it may, if it's just renewing, it will just stay active, but these are all the status options that may be applied, so incomplete, cancelled, unpaid, etc. Okay, so in the Zapier example you can see here I'm just getting the trigger, and I'm creating an email in my Gmail account, but obviously you can have that do whatever you want based on the information. Okay, so moving on to the next item is a new extension. So we jump back here. So in extensions, if you enable that through the portal, it's a meta conversion API integration. So this is the Facebook business marketing analytics and tracking functionality. So I guess similar to Google Analytics in a way, but this is connected to all your Facebook marketing activity. So obviously enable that extension through the portal. It's then available in the admin, and very similar to the Google Analytics, you add in your pixel ID and the access token. So there's a few links here to the documentation on how this is working, what sort of information it's tracking, and how to get those tokens and IDs. Obviously you're going to have to set up probably developer access, and I know you do need a business account in Facebook, so yeah, there's a bit of setup involved, but then basically there will be automatic tracking through the website for various things, and the supported events that it tracks at the moment is an add to cart event, initiate checkout, complete registration, a lead and a purchase. So these are meta events that they've got set up, so you can attach to those events and get them logged in their analytics. So then it just talks about the extension page in the admin, so that's obviously what we're looking at now, just to put in your IDs and the tokens. And then there's a little bit more information here about what those events are, how they're triggered, and how you can expect them to work. So again, it's very similar to the Google Analytics integration. It sort of just puts all that tracking code in place for you and tracks the events automatically. Okay, the next item here is the Google Analytics events output via component and API. So what this is basically a liquid component and an API endpoint that's now connected to your Google Analytics. If you've set that up in the settings, set up analytics. So obviously if you have this set up and you're looking at your analytics in your dashboard and that's all tracking, you can now access that data on the front end to display charts or get the information and do your own report building based on that. So I guess this might be helpful, if you have a member zone, you can present to them statistics about the website and obviously filter it accordingly and to what events you want them to see. Maybe it's an admin-based sort of intranet zone that you've got happening, or perhaps even you could use it to personalize sites or further customize them based on data. So if a particular product is viewed a lot more than others, you could style the page that says that's a popular product. I'm guessing things like that would become possible with this data, just depending on how you can dig into it and filter it. So I haven't explored that completely, but that's what I'm imagining this would be useful for. Okay, so there's a developer link here just to get an idea on what the reporting API is doing, what sort of data it's passing through, just so you can familiarize yourself with that if you're using this. And just obviously the note here that I mentioned before, you need to be using the Google Analytics integration through the admin for this to work. So this shows you the request JSON that you can send to the API through the component. I think this is like a basic template that's sort of the default, so you don't have to necessarily specify all this. It's only if you want to customize the filtering or what you're requesting from the API. So this is the component, so a new component tag of type Frontend API. It's got a parameter for the API endpoint and then a parameter for the request. So this just is referring to this request up here. So from my test, if you just leave that blank, it's going to use the default and that will just pull in everything. So you can leave that blank. Layout, so I don't believe there is a layout with this one, but there is a chart which we'll go into in a little minute, and you can push it to a collection variable. So just talking about the request, again there's the developer link there to get more information about how to build that request if you are customizing this, and just the logic for the layout. Just noting that the response that comes back will obviously be in JSON and it'll be attached to the this object, so this.response. So you should be able to access all that in Liquid, along with error messages, pretty much the same as like other requests like form submissions and things like that. And yes, just noting here the default layout is empty. So obviously you build your own if you're wanting to use the layout side of things. And then there's an example here of the response. So this is the this.response object. So it brings back all the information. So basically what's happening here, it's kind of setting up a table or a database. So it's returning that information rather. So the headers, it's setting up the headers here for date, the event name, and there's 2 custom event headers. And then each item, or in this case rows, are giving us the values there. So that's the date for the first column, the event type, so the event type that Google is tracking, so it could be a page view or click or something like that. And then there's 2 custom ones here that obviously you can integrate those as well if you're tracking those in your Google Analytics. And then there's the metric value, so the actual number of clicks or whatever event you're tracking. And then that just repeats for all the dates or items, however you're filtering the data that you want. So obviously from this you can build out a table or a graph or something like that. Okay, and as mentioned at the start, so not only is it a component, a liquid component that we can get this API endpoint with, there's also just like a get API endpoint, so you can pass that through your own code or JavaScript or a form or something like that. You can structure the API endpoint with URL parameters, basically just passing in all that same information that was in the request object. So you would basically convert that to a URL parameter string and pass that through the API that way. So this gets a bit crazy, but I imagine you could like set up a form or something like that to automatically sort of serialize that into a URL parameter and pass that through a form submission or something like that, basically like a search. Okay, then we have API endpoint restrictions. So there's another backlog item here that's to do with restrictions for API endpoints, because there's a few new API endpoints introduced and a few changes to existing ones. There's some new restriction settings in place. So this point here is just referring to point 2 of the API endpoint restrictions logic. So that's another backlog item in here, which we'll get to in a moment. But essentially it allows you to like set up admin user roles to not allow access to the endpoint, or you have to actually enable the endpoint to work before it can be used anyway. So that's just a section to turn the API endpoint on, basically, for this one and some others that we'll talk about here as well. Okay, and there's a default include file for the chart. So like I mentioned before, there's no layout for this one specifically, but there is a include file that's been set up to generate a chart using the Google Charts API. So the address to the include file is in the CMS assets folder. So if you want to look at that and sort of customize it for your own use, you'll need to access that via FTP. It's not accessible through the admin or the file manager. And it's just saying here that the chart by default has start date and end date UI elements in there to select, so you can change the dates dynamically for the chart. So it's much like what's being presented here in the dashboard, where you've got, in this case it's like a date range, but this one's a start and end date. You'll have those elements there and the chart will change accordingly. But this is for the front end, so you can put this into a secure zone on your actual website. Okay, and then of course it's being added to the toolbox, or the component manager. So if we're, for example, looking at a page and we go to our components manager, we now have Frontend API, and we can see the Google Analytics 4 reporting chart. So you can select that, and for the initial request, you can specify your start and end dates. You can specify what type of event that you want to request. So obviously with Google Analytics, there's hundreds, maybe even thousands of tracking events like clicks and page views and things like that, and probably even custom ones that you can set up. So you can enter that in there. Now, I did ask, but at the moment, it's just a single event. You can't add multiple events here to bring in to the one chart. So you'd have to do individual charts for each individual event. And then there's a code box here to put in that request JSON. So that was further up if you're customizing that. Otherwise, you can leave that blank. And then it gives you the include code to put on your page. And that will render out that chart. And I'll just make the note here that if you are providing a request JSON, all the other fields will be ignored. So obviously you're already specifying the event name, the start and end dates in the request object. So if that's going to override any of these ones here. So basically these are for if you're just using the default request. Then we have Secure Zone Subscribers Analytics. So very similar to the Google Analytics report that we've just looked at, this is for Secure Zone subscribers. So again, we have a new component of type Frontend API. So it's just accessing another API for statistics or analytics, but these are specifically for when new subscribers occur. So if someone signs up, registers to a secure zone, that will be tracked by the CMS. So this isn't Google Analytics tracking, I don't believe. I think this is sort of built-in just tracking for when subscribers register. And then you'll be able to access that data and either get it in Liquid or again push it to a chart. And again, they're using the Google Charts API to build that chart based on the custom analytics data being passed to it. So again, this just goes into how that's set up, what the code looks like, the component code. Again, the request object is a lot simpler in this case. So we're just asking for basically a start date, an end date, a filter expression. So basically you can filter it by secure zone. So if you have multiple secure zones that you have on your site that people are subscribing to, but you may not want to report on all of them. So you can actually filter which secure zones you want to have displayed in the chart. And if you leave that blank, then it will just pass an empty secure zones array and show all secure zones. And then there's a sorting expression as well. So we can pass just two parameters to sort by date. That's the only sorting we have at the moment. So basically ascending or descending. And the group type. So the way it groups the analytic data together. So you can specify whether you want to basically group or view it by day, week, month, or year. So they're the parameters that you can set for the reporting. So again, like the other API endpoint, obviously the response will be attached to a Liquid object. So in the layout or page that you're building to display this information, you'll be able to access that response, obviously, with this.response. And this is an example of the response. So again, basically setting up a table with rows. You've got the column headings, so the date, the total, and the secure zone names, and then you get all the metrics per each date. So in this case, we got a total for all the subscribers on that date, and then an individual breakup of the subscribers per secure zone for that date. And obviously, if you had other dates where people were subscribing, that would be repeated here in an array. And again, not only can we access this through a Liquid component, but you can just use the URL endpoint as well. And again, with URL parameters to pass us the request to that API. And as I mentioned before too, there's API endpoint restrictions. So again, there's admin user role restrictions. And again, there's a include file for the chart. So pre-configured chart, which you can find again in the CMS assets. And this chart will have user interface options, again for start and end dates, but also for the group type. So you can change day, week, month, year, how you view that data. This is just a bit of an example of what's in the include file. I think there's actually a bit more going on there, but that's been left out here. But yeah, you can take a look at that include file to get an idea how that's working. And of course, customize your own if you need to. And this has been added to the toolbox as well. So in the same place as the Google Analytics reporting. So we can see secure zone analytics chart. So again, very similar start and end dates, the secure zones that you want to report on, and how you want to display them. Or you can override with your own request JSON and then copy the code for the include file. Now I do have that set up to demonstrate. Just quickly go. Okay, so, and this is good to note that these API endpoints are for logged in members only, so you can only present that information to logged in users. Okay, so I'm logged in now, and now I can see the chart. I can see our interface options here for selecting the date and the grouping. And we can see all our secure zones being added to the chart here as well. And just to show you the liquid, how you can access any liquid, I've output that via liquid as well, so you can access all that information. So essentially what we're seeing here is a total of subscribers, being 3 in total for this particular date. And then we can see the breakdown that for secure zone 4, I think it is, nope, recurring 1, that's the name of one of the secure zones. We've had 2 registrations, and for secure zone 3 we've had 1 registration. And obviously if you change the date range from here, let's just go back a whole heap, then we can pull in that information as well. And so the previous Google Analytics chart is very similar, although it only reports on one event at a time. Okay, so module item Frontend API forms extending. So that's a bit of a mouthful, that title, but basically what it's referring to is the front-end forms that we have for submitting front-end items, so custom module items submitted via a logged-in user. Obviously we could create, edit and delete those items, and they were the front-end endpoints that we had available. Now we also have 2 more for allowing the creation of draft items and to publish draft items. So we could create drafts and publish drafts in the admin for certain items, and now we have access to that in the front end as well for creating drafts and pushing those live. So in our custom module settings, so let me just look at, go to this one. If we go to our settings, so under site user permissions, okay, so been quite a few changes to the interface here and more options introduced. So obviously if we click on the edit, now it brings out the drawer, and we have all the options in here. So for the workflow, the autoresponder, and API restrictions. So there's been a few changes with these. So looking at the notes here, autoresponder updates. So we're now able to configure autoresponder settings. So these settings for each of these actions, instead of just one single autoresponder. Like it would be the same autoresponder for any of the actions if you turned on autoresponders. But now we have an individual autoresponder for each individual action. So obviously that allows a lot more flexibility and customization for notifying and sending out those emails based on different types of editing that's occurring. And there's just some information here about, so obviously previously we just had one autoresponder. Now that there's multiple autoresponders, it's going, the system with the 6.11 update, it's copied all those autoresponder settings to all the other new autoresponders if they were turned on. And the new ones that we have for draft, updating draft and publishing draft, they'll remain blank because obviously there was no previous autoresponder settings that would have applied to those. So that's just what these notes are referring to here. And then we extend the autoresponder settings. So now we have a receiver. We can actually choose who receives the autoresponder. So we can say, okay, we want it to be the person who's sending the form, the person who submitted that form, and that's how it was by default previously. Or now we can set it to the item owner. So when someone submits or updates, so this is only relevant to updating items or publishing or deleting, when the item is updated by some member, the actual owner of that item receives the autoresponder. So it may not be the owner who's updating it if you've allowed those permissions. And then we can set it to both. So both the sender and the owner get the autoresponder. So this is really cool now. We can really customize who gets those notifications. So previously you would have had to attach another form in the background and submit that, with Ajax or something to notify someone else. It was really tricky. So now we've got that capability. Okay, and it's just noting here that for create item actions, so the creating an item, so there's no item existing, you're creating a new one. Obviously, there's no difference between the owner and the form sender. Okay, and then we have the restrictions. So this has changed up a bit as well. So we've got a few more options. I might just put that back there. So I think previously we just had like who could perform this action. So we're looking at the update draft. So you could allow anyone to update other items, or you could just allow the owner of the item to update. So we've got those options there, but we've also got additional options for allowing, so again, like logged in users. So obviously you have to be logged in anyway to update items. So that's sort of the default option, logged in users. Or you can specify that only users from specific secure zones can update this draft. So you could select, say, these 3 zones. So if the user belongs to any one of those zones, then they'll be able to perform this action. So they may be logged in, but they're logged into, say, a different secure zone, then they still won't have permissions to edit this item. Or we can say, okay, we only want admin users to be able to edit this item. So in this case, admin users are referring to the CRM contact type of admin user. So you can, if you have an admin user that's like an admin user for the admin, and then you add them to the CRM, and so these are the users that have the little gear icon. So if we look at this and we edit, we can come down and the role of this contact is, so it's usually general, but you can change that to admin user. So that just signifies that they're now like an admin user in their contact as well. So if they log in to secure zones, we can look at that sort of as a type of logged in user to give different permissions. Like in this case, we're now able to say that admin users, if they're logged in, well, they can update. You could assign that to all items. So an admin user obviously can edit anything they like, but you can put restrictions on other general logged in users to have more control over that. So a lot of flexibility and control there with who can submit these front-end APIs now. Okay, and they're just saying, so they're now adding public API endpoints for the save draft and publish draft. So again, that's just the endpoint that's used. So if you're setting up a form, this is the form action that's going to be used. So there's 2 new endpoints there, and then there's just outlining the logic, which we've sort of gone through how that would work anyway. Update to the toolbox, so you can now access these in the toolbox as well. So we're on a page. If you're looking at custom modules, so where we had create item form, update item form, delete item form, and now we have update items draft and publish items draft. So you can build the forms for those as well. So you select your module, whichever one, and then you can grab the form code. Okay, so now, because we can edit drafts and publish drafts, that means we need a way to retrieve the data for the draft version of the page, because normally you might be on the detail page that you have the edit form for that item on, or you've configured the form to get the information for the item you want to edit. But that's going to pull in the live data for that item. So the name, the description, etc. is all going to be the live version. But if you have a draft sitting behind that, how are we going to update that draft? So this is now an addition to the component parameters. So we can now add get draft. So if we're setting up, let's just go back here. Say we're getting the item, so let's just say home slider here. So when we're building this out and we're getting the parameters for this component here, you can add get draft as a parameter equals true, and then it will return the draft item data rather live. So then you can use that in your forms for updating the item. So that's fine for returning it via the component, but if you're looking at the detail page, so actually I've got an example here. If I go home slider, so this item here, actually I'll just go in, so we can see this is the live description here. So this is the live version, but there's a draft that we can see here. So if I turn on draft mode and come down, we can see that the description now is draft description. So we've got two versions of this sitting here. So if I preview this, we can see this is the live preview. But if we wanted to have a front-end form here for updating this item on the detail page, as we're on now, we can do that as well by adding a parameter to the URL of draft preview equals true, and then that will display the draft version of the page. And that's what point 6 here is talking about with the draft preview parameter. So this is going to be really good for those cases where you've got users submitting items, but you want to be able to moderate those submissions and check what they're changing and approve them before they actually go live. So now you can build that into that process where they are actually submitting drafts, and you could even have a page where you're comparing the live and the draft modes, see the changes, and then you might have an admin process where the admin publishes those drafts once they're approved, or you pass that back to the user to publish those. So yeah, a lot more control now, and making that fit a lot more business models, I guess, for how user-submitted content would normally work. Okay, so next item, we have Frontend API access restrictions. So now we're just going to go into more about the restrictions that have been changed a little bit here. So like we looked at before in the module settings, so obviously under site user permissions, so we can get into those sort of API restrictions. There's also the two other APIs we're talking about for the Google Analytics reporting and the Secure Zone Analytics. So they're front-end APIs as well. So they've created a whole new section under settings, front-end API restrictions. So we can see our two tabs here. So I'll just jump to the module one first, because this basically has all your modules and then all the events, the types of updating, and you can set all those same permissions that you can access in the module settings. So they're all accessible in the one place now here, so it's a bit easier to go through and change all those and adjust them all. So basically you've got the same options here, but then we have the miscellaneous APIs, which are the Google Analytics and the Secure Zone. So basically here we need to turn them on, so they're off by default. So you can enable the endpoint, but then you can also specify, well, who can actually see that data. So you can just have any logged in user could see, like that Secure Zone chart that I had, or you can select people from particular Secure Zones, or you can just have admin users only. So that's helpful, obviously, if you're having a front-end intranet that you're building for just for the admin users, then you can lock that down just for those types of logged in users. So obviously when there's more front-end APIs developed, they'll all come into here, so you can control the access all in one place. And then there's also the admin user restrictions, so for accessing this in the admin. So under our admin user roles, because this is a new feature, a new section in the admin, you can of course control what admin users have access to this as well. So I think it's down here. Yep, so front-end API restrictions. So they can view or can edit, so you can turn those on and off as well. Okay, and this is available right from Essential, so that's in all sites. Okay, next item is a little change to the category module, how they're viewed. So this is a fairly small change, but it just makes it a little bit clearer on how we're looking at those categories. So what is this? So if I go to categories under settings, so obviously if you have a big category structure with a lot of nested items, you get this sort of tree view. And so obviously I've got very deep nesting. Now if you've worked with categories before, when you look at those, when you're selecting those categories in a module item or something like that, or when you're outputting those categories or working with them in Liquid, the system appends all these dashes. So you get 4 dashes at the start of any nested category, and then it adds another 4 every time it's nested. So if we go and look at portfolio, so as you can see here, this starts at category 3, which was already a nested category. So that's because the portfolio settings, in our properties, when we've enabled categories, we can choose the parent that we want to only select categories from for that module. So you can see here that the parent category here was a nested category to begin with, so it had the 4 dashes. But when we go into an item to select that category, we see 3 as the parent without any dashes. So it just removes unnecessary dashes, essentially. So when we're looking at it here, we're essentially seeing this as the parent, because for this module, that is the parent category. We're not going to have anything above that. So for all intents and purposes, this is the start. So then we start the dashes from there. So that's essentially all this changes, just so we don't have a whole bunch of dashes right at the top, and then these ones are even more exaggerated from that. Now, this is under a feature flag. I guess just in case there's any compatibility issues, if you're using any filtering or checks in a custom Liquid implementation where you're using the versions that have those dashes, and maybe you're checking for a specific string to match, then it may not have the same amount of dashes anymore. So that's probably why this has been put under the beta features up here in the gear menu. So you just need to turn that on if you want to apply that. Now, if you are doing some custom work with categories, I suggest you come in and turn that on and check, because this obviously will be applied later, probably by the next release. So definitely check that. But in general, it should be fine, because I think in most cases we're using the category name with the / to denote the category structure when we're doing any component filtering or anything like that. So it would probably only relate to very specific Liquid customization implementations that you may have. But yeah, if you want to turn that on, it's under the beta features. Oh, and just on the category component, because there is a Liquid component to output the categories that has a parameter called parent category. I'll just bring in the documentation for that category component. So this component here for categories, which will list all the categories on your site, but there is a parameter that says parent category, so you can only list out the categories from a particular parent. So if you just want to get the child categories of one specific parent, you can enter the parent in. So looking at, this is the full output here, we can see, for example here I've got a subcategory, so this is indented with the 4 dashes. But if I was to use this category as a parent, put that into the parent category, then the output would change. So I wouldn't see these items anymore. I would start with this item. But I'm guessing what it's saying here is that we wouldn't have these dashes on that anymore. So because we've chosen this as the parent, just like we saw in the admin, it would then strip away this and again for the subcategories underneath that, we would lose 4 dashes, and then so on and so forth. So it's just sort of cleaning that up a bit. But that's where I mentioned that if you're actually using this liquid to do any custom integration implementations, and you're using the name with the dashes, then that's where something might break if you're checking for that exact string, because obviously it's going to change depending on how you call this component. But yeah, in general, we're either using the ID, or for most filtering, we're using the full name. So hopefully that's a rare case, but just to be aware of that. Okay, next item is subscriptions list to contact liquid object. So when we get the contact information, like for a logged in user, or if we're using the contact components here, like here, CRM contacts. And now there's some more information that's been added to the liquid output, and that is for reoccurring subscriptions. So we can see here in the documentation we have now the reoccurring subscription object here, which is currently an empty array. Now it's likely empty for 2 possible reasons. The first is because these contact records don't have any recurring subscriptions, but also because you need to essentially enable it on the component with a new parameter. So that's what it's talking about here, I believe. So like we have the include secure zone info, that's already in place for the general secure zone, these here. So what secure zones this contact is subscribed to. We'll now have another parameter called include recurring subscriptions. So that hasn't been added to the documentation just yet. But we can add that parameter in, and then that will display any of the recurring subscriptions that contact record has. So if it's not specified, you'll just get an empty array. Or of course, if the contact doesn't have any recurring subscriptions, you'll have an empty array as well. And this is the type of data that will come out. So this would be in this array here. So we're going to get the sort of the order code, or the reoccurring item code in the admin. So that's sort of be a big long code. You have the status, so whether it's active or unpaid or whatever. The member ID, so that's just the contact ID, and then an array of any recurring products. So products refers to items, I guess, so it could be a recurring event, a recurring product payment, or a secure zone, or just a general form payment. And they'll be listed down there with the ID of the product, whatever it may be, and the name and the entity type. So if it was a product or an event, then it would have module item. If it was a form payment, it would just have form, I believe. So these align with the new Zapier trigger for secure get zone changes. So this is just the information that's added now to the contact record. So not only if you're using this component, the CRM contacts component, but also if you're looking at the request.current member. So this is used for showing a logged in user's CRM information. So it's essentially the same information we're seeing here, but it's just one item for that particular logged in user. So that will include their recurring subscriptions as well. So you can use this for displaying to a user not only what zones they're subscribed to, but if they have a recurring subscription to anything like an event or a product or whatever, you can display those as well. Okay, moving to the next item. So this is a change in the WYSISYG editor for a new feature called custom widgets. So this is pretty cool. If we go into our admin, we'll go to a page, just go here. So if we're looking at the WYSISYG view, we now have this new icon here called Insert Custom Widget. We click on that and we'll open up the drawer. And now you can add items to this. So this is one I've set up. We can give it a name and a thumbnail image. So the way I imagine using this is, or one possible use case is to set up like components, like HTML components, just like a heading and 3 columns like I've done here, or any layout component, so that your clients can just chuck those into the WYSISYG and go from there, rather than them having to try and build, because depending on what framework you're using or how you need to structure the HTML, usually not something you want the client to be having to worry about. So we could come down here, wherever the cursor is, we can then click on this and it inserts that HTML structure. And so if we go to code view and have a look at this, so we can see I've put in a H2 with a row and cells. So that's all correctly structured for them to now work in. So they can just come and change the default placeholder information that you've put in your little snippet or widget. Now, how do we set up those? This is kind of buried away at the moment. It's under settings and miscellaneous. And now we have a new tab here called WYSISYG Custom Widgets. So we can just go and create new widgets, so give it a name. We can select or upload a preview image, so an image that we want to represent whatever the widget is. So that's totally up to you. And then whatever code you want to be inserted into the WYSISYG when they select that item. So pretty straightforward at the moment. I can see a whole bunch of improvements that could be made on this one, and thousands of possibilities on how you could use this. So yeah, really powerful. Kind of brings a bit more client-focused editing capabilities, I think, to things like site globals and snippets, where they're a little bit more on the technical side or developer-friendly side, where this is more focused for the client and helping them build that HTML structure without breaking things and making a mess of it. Okay, next item. So this is a bit of a technical improvement for the HTTP headers. So if you've looked at these, so there's a HTTP header called a content security policy. So essentially this allows you to configure all the types of assets that you are going to allow to run on your site. So without the content security policy, obviously you can add in scripts, iframes, images, styles, all that sort of stuff, and that's fine. That's how it's all meant to work. But if you want to lock down that security and not allow certain scripts, or you only want to allow scripts and iframes and other assets to load on your site if they pass your security policy, basically. So if you've specifically allowed them to. So there's a whole bunch of ways you can do that with the security policy. Different values that you can put in here to allow certain scripts to run from certain domains, to filter what's allowed to run on your site, basically. So the nonce item here is a way to add a value here. So it's like a key that's unique and specific to your site. So it basically is like the key to say, yes, anything that has this value is allowed to run based on my security policy that we're setting up. And so we need a way to give that nonce a unique value and a secure value. Okay, so they've set up this liquid tag CSP nonce hash, which will allow us to dynamically insert that in everything, because you don't want to have to manually go through and update and change those sorts of strings, those unique values that you've set up. So basically you can set that in your security policy. So you could come in here, add in the value. Where's my script? So script source, so you could add that in here. So when you put in nonce, CSP nonce hash, So the system will then generate that hash key or value, and as long as you've coded your scripts to use this liquid variable here, then it'll put in the correct hash that's associated with your security content policy. So hopefully I've explained that well. I'm not completely up on how all that works, but that's how I understand it, and hopefully I've explained it enough. But certainly if you Google content security policies, there's a whole bunch of information on how to set these up and get all this to work. And essentially what this is doing is stopping the ability for bad actors to inject scripts and different types of assets and things into your site and have them run just because that's the way the web works. So the content security policy enables you to block anything that you haven't otherwise previously determined to be okay. All right, so I think we'll move on from that one. But there's a bunch of information there you can read on how that's actually going to work and how that's going to come out on your site. So have a look at that. Oh, and there's a link here to read about the content security policies, specifically about the nonce property. Okay, site search keywords, case insensitive search. So this is kind of just a fix to the site search. So previously, site search was case sensitive. So if you had a page, say, called test, well, in the example they're giving here is in the keywords field, but it could be anywhere. Let's say you've got a keyword, some keyword with a capital S and capital K. If you did a site search front end for some keyword and you just had it all in lowercase, it wouldn't actually return this item. You have to match the case exactly, which probably isn't a good thing for searching. So they've now made it case insensitive. So regardless of how you enter the search phrase, it will still return the result if it matches. Now we have some new liquid filters. And I guess this came about because of the content security policy and this whole nonce needing some sort of hash value, or unique hash value to generate. So I guess in the process of making that possible, they've added some new liquid filters that are around the same sort of principle of generating these random or unique values. So these could come in quite handy with your liquid coding in some situations, and there are 3 new ones. We have a unique filter, and I've got a little demo here which helps with this. Okay, so each 3 of these do slightly different things, and I might actually start with the random one first because that's a little bit easier to understand. So random basically just generates a random number from a range that you give it. So if we go down to here, so basically it doesn't really matter on the string that you pass it. There doesn't have to be a string, so in this case we could just do a blank string. We can say random between the range of x and x. So in this case I've just done 5 and 80, so it's going to return a random number between 5 and 80. So let's just take a look at this page. Okay, so we've got a random, it's just spitting out a random number. So you can see it's never higher than 80 and never lower than 5. And every time you refresh, it just changes. So it's just giving us a random number. And that can be helpful in coding in some instances where you just need something random, or you need to create a random ID for something within a given range. Or maybe like a random item number. So you might have 5 items and you want to get to a random one, and you just want to add that into some JavaScript. You could just do a random liquid filter between 1 and 5, and that would give you a random number. That's just one small example. And then in a similar way, we have the unique filter, which doesn't give us a random number, but it gives us a random string based on a predefined format. So we kind of have these formats that are just denoted as N, D, B, P, and X for some reason. I'm not sure why, but obviously they stand for some particular way of generating these strings. So you can see there's a specific format for these different format options. Again, in this case, it doesn't really matter what the string is that you're putting in the liquid filter. You could just have a blank string and it's still going to give you the same formatted output, although it's going to be random each time. So again, looking at our demo page, every time I refresh, these strings here just change to just random outputs. Doesn't matter what the initial string was that you gave it. It's just going to be a random output. And I guess that's just helpful again for creating some sort of unique random value for your programming. You know, maybe a random number between a certain range is not going to be good enough. You need a much more unique value, and maybe more for security purposes. It needs to be a lot longer and sort of no chance of hacking or guessing that number. And then we have the hash filter, which is a little bit more to do with security, like secure referencing, I guess, or indexing. So if we look at our demo page, at the hash strings, and I refresh, we're not getting new values every time I refresh. And you can see passing the string. So I've passed in anything as a string, and then I've passed in anything on a second one, and then I've given a blank string for a third one. And we can see that based on the string of anything, it gives us the exact same hash every time. So, and for a blank string, it gives us a blank hash. What this allows us to do is assign kind of a unique identifier, or like an ID or an index value that matches our initial string, but without displaying our initial string. So think about if you had a password and you store the password securely, say in the admin, but on some other application, like in the front end or maybe an API that you're using, you need to still pass a unique string for that password that you can then reference later if you're then matching up, say, a user authentication that you're matching again later with your own database. So the information that you're passing to your application can use some sort of unique identifier for that user without revealing their password and passing that password through third-party applications. But you can then use that unique string to cross-reference with your own secure database in a secure way when you're ready to. So yeah, these are pretty unique, discrete use cases that you're going to have for these, but they're handy to have. Particularly just a random number generator is pretty handy, because it's a bit tricky to do that in Liquid just by itself. You have to do a few little steps, and it's probably not really that random. So certainly the random filters are going to be handy, and you might find some sort of use for the hashing. Okay, and that brings us to the end. So thank you, and hope you find some uses for all these new features.